So I'm here with Cyndy Sheldon, and Cyndy, go right ahead.
Thanks, Chris. My name is Cyndy Sheldon, and I am a clinical social worker, retired now, and have been involved in Gestalt Therapy since 1961. And I want today to present a theme that doesn't seem to get too much traction right now, and I hope it will get more traction over the years. And those of you out there who are interested in this theme, I hope you will pursue it and write about it, talk about it, demonstrate it, whatever. And the theme is the egalitarian influence in Gestalt therapy. Fritz Perls, one of the founders, often talked about pay attention to the obvious. Now, this wasn't so obvious. However, some of us who really value the egalitarian um, aspects of life saw it and found it within the works of Fritz and Laura Perls. So I want to just talk about a little bit about that today. I've been teaching Gestalt therapy and doing it since 1967. I first met Fritz Perls when he visited the West Coast and was a teacher of a dream seminar that my Gestalt therapist, the only one in Northern California at the time, had invited him to do. And so I sat in this room. I was, 26 years old and very new, although I'd had a couple of years of Gestalt group work and individual therapy. I was very new to all this, and I was still a graduate student and so forth. So I sat in this dark room while Fritz worked with somebody else on a dream, and I heard a voice. And the voice said to me, "You are going to be doing this work for the rest of your life." Well, I didn't know what that meant, but it stuck with me. And Fritz then went back to New York after the seminar and didn't move to California for another few years. I waited for him. I don't know why, but I waited for him. And when he arrived in 65, I think he went to Esalen and Big Sur, and he started to set up training workshops in 66 and so forth. So I went down into Big Sur and spent all of August of 1966, two-week long workshops, one for non-professionals and one for professionals. My husband attended the first one with me, and the second one I went to by myself and met all kinds of interesting people. And that was like the beginning of the movement in California of setting up other Gestalt Institutes. There already was one in New York City and Cleveland. But by 1967, we set up this first San Francisco Institute. And right after we set ours up, LA set theirs up, I think in 68, or maybe it was later in 67, I'm not sure. So that was a very exciting time, as you can imagine. I want to look at my notes here for a minute because I want to make sure I'm covering everything. I think that the background of what was going on at this time is really important. It was the 60s, and everybody's heard a little bit about the 60s. Although a friend of mine said he thought it started in LA, but I said, no, I think it started in San Francisco. And so here we were actually setting up a location in the Haight-Ashbury, which is the famous site of the hippie movement in the 60s, for the first Gestalt training. It was at an old Victorian house that Janie Ryan, who's our art therapist, who became our art therapist. She rented this huge house, and we used to have workshops there with Fritz. And I remember going down on the corner in the Haight-Ashbury during lunch break with Fritz and observing the postures of the hippies. It was really quite an experience. And he would point out different things about the postures. I think at that time he had already met Ida Rolf and had gotten involved with Rolfing, which was a form of body work that eventually became quite well known in the US. So the background of all of this time was not only were the hippies part of it, but you had such things as the women's movement, the Black movement, the student, the rebellion of the students on campus, the free speech movement. And then came the many spiritual movements from India and Asia, Buddhist and Hindu influences. It was an incredible time. It was so much was going on that it was almost overwhelming. And I remember making a decision that I had to get out of the state of California 2 weeks twice a year in order to absorb and integrate everything that was going on. So that was the background. And then Gestalt therapy and the human potential movement. Now, the human potential movement was really an amazing phenomenon. Those of you who were therapists before this came may remember that the therapist really was the doctor who knew best and was the one who made interpretations with their clients and treated their clients as patients, not as clients. And it was really a very top-down, more authoritarian orientation. Along comes Abraham Maslow, Rollo May, Eric Berne, Carl Rogers, Fritz Perls, Virginia Satir, and probably a number of others that I haven't mentioned. And they started to humanize the whole relationship between therapist and client. And it was quite an amazing phenomenon. I mean, I was there when it shifted. And I took workshops with Eric Berne, but mostly my orientation was with Fritz Perls and Gestalt. He had now moved to California, and his wife was still running the New York Institute. So they were still a couple, but they were on, separated now by 3,000 miles, each doing their own thing. So this whole attitude of treating the client as an equal or as an important being whose experience was more important than the interpretation of the therapist was really mind-blowing. It was a whole new way of working. And that became sort of the essence of the new wave that was carried out in all these other movements I've mentioned. So that was what was going on then. So Fritz is now living in his own house at the Gestalt Institute in Big Sur. They built one for him. And it was pretty exciting, except that there was a teacher down there that didn't get along with Fritz, or he didn't get along with him, named Bill Schutz. And Bill Schutz was really pushing his students to confront each other. And it was much more of a confrontational, where a lot of anger was expressed, and very much not the same as what Fritz Perls was doing. Although a lot of people got confused and thought Fritz Perls was pushing this kind of confrontation, which he wasn't. He was much more likely to call it a projection, that if you're angry at somebody, it's a projection of yourself. And so he would say, if somebody was angry at Fritz, Fritz would say to the person in the group, put your Fritz on the empty chair and yell at him, not me. And so he would do that. It was a very, very, very interesting experience for all of us to watch. So let me just say a few things about Fritz. He stayed in California till about 1969, and then he left for Vancouver Island in British Columbia. Now, Fritz was guided to get the hell out of Germany in 1933 when Hitler took over. And he and Laura, I think, first went to Holland, and then it ended up in South Africa. At first, South Africa was a very good place for him. However, the tide turned into a more authoritarian regime, and eventually Fritz left South Africa and came to New York. And that was in 1946 that they moved there. They had 2 kids, Renata and Stephen, and they set up an institute and training and started doing trainings like in Cleveland and other places on the East Coast. So their new wave of working, which was inspired by many different philosophies, everything from existentialism to field theory to the work of the Prime Minister of South Africa, Smut, S-M-U-T, I've forgotten his first name. And plus all the body work that Laura was involved in and the psychoanalysis for sure. Fritz was a psychoanalytic trainee for a while. And so they had many influences. And also of interest is the fact that both of them had gotten involved with Zen Buddhism in Germany in the 30s. And that highly influenced Gestalt therapy way back then, which a lot of people didn't realize, because they often see Zen as having been an influence on the west coast of California, but it was true in Europe as well. So, so Fritz, after he came to the United States and had been here for a few years, Nixon was sort of in the wings there in this country, and he began to see the authoritarianism of Nixon and felt he had to get out of the United States. And that's what spurred him to move on to Canada. Again, running away from a third authoritarian regime. And he was very, very worried about all that. And as you can imagine, what he was teaching was so anti-authoritarian, although none of us really realized that at the time. But to him, he felt like he might get, there might be consequences to his teachings if he was teaching in an authoritarian regime. So he took off for Canada in '69, bought an old motel and set up shop and had his own community. He didn't have any other leaders there except himself and his Gestalt people. And that lasted for a very short time because he died in 1970 and still married to Laura. Laura was with him when he passed away at a workshop in Chicago in 1970. And in the later years of his life, he was very, very busy trying to do as many videos of his work as he could to get the ideas out there. So that a lot of the work he did was overly punctuated with techniques and exercises, which ordinarily he wouldn't be doing so much of, but he wanted to get this information out. And so he pushed himself. And of course, at that time, the technology was terrible. So the videos are pretty bad. And there's very little, the kind of quality of things we have nowadays was not available back in the 60s. However, he did what he did and the messages got out. And the thing that's so amazing is that in the last 70 years, after the first four institutes, New York, Cleveland, San Francisco, and LA, after those institutes started, it suddenly took off like wildfire. And now there's even a Gestalt Institute on mainland China. I got an email from a German woman who started it, and she's teaching it at a college, a university. She's a psychology teacher in a university. Forgotten the name of the town, or therefore she is. So the world is changing in that regard in a very positive way. People are learning to become more experiential. So it's been very exciting to be involved in all this. And I want to give you a chance, Chris, if there's anything that's coming up that you want to ask about in those early days, because you were involved too.
Well, I did not get into the Gestalt Institute in LA until 1978. So some of this information is really new to me that I haven't heard before. I'm fascinated with it. I'm appreciating hearing what you remember, what you know about Fritz Perls, and very eager also to hear all the rest you have to say about the San Francisco Institute. I had one question. I'm going to go back to my notes about, well, I guess I'm just going to let you get to the San Francisco Institute when you get to it,
Okay.
because this is all um, very important material that you're telling us already here.
Oh, okay.
All
Thanks.
right, thanks.
So let me say a little bit more about Fritz's abilities besides being a psychiatrist and a psychologist. Um, he used to say at Esalen, he said, I have an MD, a PhD, and LSD. So at one point, somebody gave him a bottle of LSD just before he went to Asia. And I think he took LSD in some Buddhist temples when he was over there. I never heard him speak specifically about his adventures, but that was his intent. And so we used to giggle about that a lot, about his LSD beside his title. He also was, he flew airplanes, he was an actor, he ice skated, he painted, and he was very much of an intellectual seeker. And existentialism influenced him a great deal. When he came to the West Coast, he hooked up with one of his students, I guess, named Jim Simkin. And Jim had built a house right next to Esalen where he did his own trainings. And back in the 60s, I used to be a guest trainer down there for his students. And Fritz and Jim got along very well, but I think that Jim always saw himself as Fritz's patient. So that at one point in a training workshop, when Fritz turned to Jim and said, Jim, I want to work with you, Jim was very reluctant to be Fritz's therapist in the group. However, he went ahead and did it because Fritz turned to him and said, I want to work on my unfinished business with Freud. Well, this was a monumental thing. This was like in one of my first big workshops at Esalen. Fritz put Freud on an empty chair and started talking to him about the unfinished business and started sobbing. He sobbed and sobbed and sobbed. And all of us, 20 people in the room, were just mesmerized by his willingness to show himself to all of us in this way. And this was, I was going to say this later on, but this was an example of how he felt like it was okay to be himself with us and not have to play the doctor knows best game that he was raised in. So that was a very important time for me because it really made me decide for sure that this is what I wanted to do, this kind of work. So let me move now on to some of the egalitarian influences that I've noticed over the years. Well, first of all, I've mentioned, that the humanization of clients, the human potential movement, where the therapist and the client really basically are equals. And the patient's, the client's awareness is valued highly by the therapist. And although the Gestalt therapist might offer a lot of experiences and experiments for the client to try on, he basically is trying to get the client to get further in touch with his awareness, because that's the key word in Gestalt, is awareness. So that kind of emphasis is totally in service of awareness and encouraging unexpected responses, which can get to a deeper level of the patient's awareness or the client's awareness. I'm slipping back into the old model by keeping using the word patient. Okay, so the humanizing of the patient-client therapist, which started in the 60s. That's number one. The second thing was really important is that local Gestalt Institutes, as they were forming, Fritz said, you get to do your own thing. I'm not going to interfere in how you run your training program. So he did not particularly want to interfere, and so the San Francisco Gestalt Institute, which I helped found, was like a co-op. We had usually around 10 to 12 therapists who were teachers and a part-time administrator. This was all before computers and everything else. And so we operated on a shoestring, and we never charged a whole lot of money. In the 60s, it was like a wave of fresh air that came through the Bay Area. And so there were so many people who wanted training and wanted to know this new way of working. We were flooded with people, even though we didn't have a website and all that kind of fancy stuff. We had a lot of students and a lot of work, and we didn't want to charge a whole lot of money. So that's how we got started. Now, those of you who know about cooperatives, some of them are based on the Quaker model, where consensus is part of the theme, part of the structure. However, we decided not to do that because we knew that we had a couple of maverick therapists on our staff who would misuse that and block and take control. So we refused to go for the consensus aspect of it, which turned out to be a good thing in the long run. I won't go into details about that. So that's the second thing. The third aspect of the egalitarian influence to me was the encouragement by Fritz and Laura to work, to see the Gestalt work of many different teachers. Now, there weren't a whole lot of us in the early days, but more and more there were, and to see the different styles so that there was a lack of imitation. Fritz never wanted people to imitate him because then they weren't their own person. They were introjecting him, which is a Gestalt term, and not allowing themselves to pick and choose aspects of different leaders that fit them. So he encouraged us seeing different styles, men and women, and for the student to be able to say, oh, I like that, but this doesn't fit me, and so forth and so on. So that was the third important thing, is having many teachers, different styles. In the early days, in both LA and San Francisco, we flew Laura Perls out to work with our students. I don't know, did she ever work with you when you were there, Laura? Chris?
She came several times when I was in the Institute, but I didn't meet her. I didn't attend any of those workshops. I went and worked with her once at the Gestalt Institute in New Orleans when she was presenting there one time.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, she was a very formidable person. And
yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and she used to stay at my house when she came, and then she found out that one of our other staff members had a better piano than I did, so she went over and stayed with him then. She was a pianist. So that brings me pretty much, well, let me just say a couple more things about this. In those early days, that as more and more people were being trained in the few institutes that were in existence, many of us were invited by our students to go to their countries to start teaching. So in San Francisco, we had a lot of Asian students, Japan, Taiwan, mostly, and in the early days, and as well as many European students who would come over. So many of us started working overseas, and that was quite an experience too. And some of the leaders from our different countries moved to Europe. And we had one that moved to Japan. And so they set up institutes when they did that. We had one of our staff members, Jerry Kogan, moved to Frankfurt and opened an institute. Larry Bloomberg moved to Italy and set up an institute, and Paula Batome moved to Japan, I think, and opened an institute. So there were a number of places that were encouraging more and more development of institutes based on these teachings of Fritz and Laura. And during that time, there was just a lot of excitement. I remember working in Germany one time, and a lot of the trainees at that time were sons and daughters of Nazis. And in Germany at that time, a number of the parents were very reluctant to let their kids know what their fathers did. And so there was a lot of secrecy. And when these young people now in their 40s, when they came into training with us, began to find out what their fathers did, the rage was just incredible. And the pain of what they found out was just overwhelming. And I remember so clearly some people just working on these issues of finding out what their fathers did. It was just extraordinarily powerful. I remember one time at a party in Germany after a workshop I went to, and one German guy just blew up and got furious and screamed, "All of our male leaders have died or moved out of the country. We have no more models." And he was just livid. That also impacted me a great deal, the fact that he experienced that in his country that he grew up in. So there were many, many stories, and I'm sure other Gestalt teachers will share those when the time comes. So let's go to the next theme of egalitarianism. And this, I don't like the word ism, of egalitarian influence in Gestalt. When Fritz was living in Big Sur at Esalen, Virginia Satir, famous family therapist, was also there at least some of the time. I don't know how much of the time. And apparently they connected very well and influenced each other. Although most people will say that Fritz didn't really understand egalitarian relationships, and that may be quite true. On some level, he and Laura had an equal relationship. They both were independent and their own person, and even though they collaborated a lot, I think they both respected each other. I'm looking at my notes here. One time, the first workshop I went with my then husband, and since we were late, Fritz never yelled at us for being late, but my husband was always late, and we arrived late in the workshop. So Fritz had us immediately get out in the middle of 20 people and sit facing each other. He was going to work with us. Of course, this was very painful and sort of, I think I went into shock. But at any rate, he had us facing each other. And he did a perception, this is his kind of couple therapy. He had us do a perception exercise. So he had us look at each other, but not at each other's faces. He said, now look above your partner's head and see the image you have of that person. So we each did that. We didn't have to say anything about it. And then he said, now I want you to come down and look at their whole being, look at their face, their body language, everything, and just see what you see and sense what you sense. And we did that. And I don't remember the details, but I remember it was a very powerful exercise. And it influenced me a lot in the future in terms of the fact that we often hang on to this imaginary perception of the other and can't make room for changes in the real person and so forth. And it was a very good learning experience for me. The Gestalt prayer comes up here, and I'm going to read it to you because some of you may already know it. I never liked it at the time, but in rereading it recently, I realized that this is so Fritz, the prayer, which became quite famous at the time. I do my thing and you do your thing. I am not in this world to live up to your expectations, and you are not in this world to live up to mine. You are you and I am I. If by chance we find each other, it's beautiful. If not, it can't be helped. So it's kind of it's not a very relational kind of prayer, but it does talk about the fact that both parties are their own person. And that's a key of an egalitarian relationship. Each one is a human being, an individual soul, however you want to put it. And the development of that being is important to most psychotherapists and most people who are really aware and in relationship. So it's not a big step into the egalitarian relationship, but it's a beginning. And I don't know if Virginia had a bigger influence on him over the years or not, but at any rate, I think it's important to acknowledge what he did do. And I don't know enough about Laura's work in New York to know what she had to say about all these things. So the other another theme in the egalitarian realm is that Fritz was very much against having a super organization, a national or international organization. Other groups had them, like Eric Berne in his transactional analysis had a national and an international organization where, you know, the people at the top get to say to the people at the bottom what's right and what's wrong. Fritz was against all that. He did not want an international or national organization. He believed in each little pod developing their own way and their own style. So that he discouraged a lot of that authoritarian thing. The two international organizations I know of, which are the Association for the Advancement of Gestalt Therapy and the European Association of Gestalt Therapy, are democratically run with a change in leadership often. So that's that theme. And then we come to something I've already mentioned, where Gestalt therapists model personal work. And I told you about Fritz working on his relationship with Freud. Recently, I worked with my students on, I had one of my students work with me on some stuff that I was going through. And that was a very powerful experience for the trainees, because our world is basically hierarchical. You know, you've got the parent child, the student teacher, and then the employer employee. Those authoritarian regimes, as benevolent as some of them are just very much in our lives, and they have to be for many reasons. So creating an egalitarian relationship is not easy, and I want to encourage everybody to take a look at this as much as you can and find ways to move forward with this development. As many of you know, more and more minorities and more women are moving into positions of power in other countries as well as in the United States, in spite of all the trauma that we're going through right now. For example, there are many women Black mayors in large cities in the US now. And this is a very interesting development, and I'm sure will continue over time. Many people talk about the fact that this coming age of Aquarius is really the rise of the feminine. It doesn't mean that the feminine is going to become authoritarian, although it could be, but it's more of the women bringing in the egalitarian influence into the world at large. Chris, I'm going to come back to you. Do you want to ask your question now, or I'm almost finished?
Oh, sorry, I forgot to unmute
Oh,
as I started to respond to you. I have you've generated several questions in me, and that I think will take lots of discussion. It is really interesting, all of the ways that you're pulling this together, Cyndy. I think about the I thou part of Gestalt therapy and how that lays the groundwork also for being egalitarian. So I I
thank you, Martin Buber.
yeah, right, yeah, yeah. Yeah, so I don't have a specific question right now, but you've stimulated lots of things that
Well, thank you
I'll
for
bring back to you.
thank you for remembering that, because I thought about it in the middle of the night and said I have to mention Martin Buber's contribution here because it was very large.
Yeah.
And Fritz was very much, and Laura were very much indebted to him for his work.
And what was their connection with him? I know, they were both in Germany, but what was their connection?
I don't know personally, whether they were connected, but certainly his work was highly influential with Fritz and Laura.
Oh,
And I love the title of the book, I Thou.
yes,
Yeah.
yeah.
So I think that I want to mention the two books that I wrote recently. They're sort of manuals, really. Chris has got them and she'll put them up.
I've got them here. I'm gonna reach behind me and pull them up.
Let's take the gray one first.
Okay, so this was the cover of the first one.
Yeah, this is called Gestalt as a Way of Life. And this is a theme of Gestalt. Doesn't talk about how to do the therapy. It really talks about some of the practices and principles of awareness that we all learned in training. And the theme way of life I got from working on the Navajo reservation, when people would ask Navajo people, well, what's your spiritual approach? And they would say, we don't have a spiritual, we don't divide things up like that. We have a way of life, period. And so I thought that that was a fitting title for what so many people I have worked with and trained, and people who've had a Gestalt background seek out other people who have had this background, because there's a way of life that we all share. And so there's a sense of community among Gestalt people that has been very valuable. So that's the first book. It's a lot of short chapters with suggested personal exercises after each chapter, and lots of references to Buddhism and other related orientations. The second book, which is called Don't Tell Me What to Do, Ask Me. This is about relationships. And as you can see, there are two beings, two birds, yakking at each other there. And this is about egalitarian relationships and how to become more aware of whether or not you have one, and if you need some guidance on how to create a more egalitarian relationship. The title of this book came from Fritz's dying words. The first part of that title, Don't Tell Me What to Do, apparently Fritz screamed at a nurse just before he died. And it's such a powerful statement that indicates a lot about who he was and a lot of people. And I see this as a theme in so many clients and so many people. They want to be their own person. They don't want somebody telling them how to be and how to do and what to do and how to be in life. So that's the theme of that one. So those are available on Amazon for anybody who would like it. And my website is still up and running, so you can get it off my website, cindysheldon.com.
And certainly, Cyndy, also your value and the priority you place on egalitarianism, egalitarian attitude,
Uh-huh.
is very apparent in your book as well. In you know, as you say here, creating egalitarian relationships for couples. So that shows through. All right, well, thank you very much for doing this. I'm going to stop the recording, but I so appreciate your giving us all of this information and background here. Thank you.
Thanks, Chris. It was interesting to do, and thank you again.